Maxwell Rothschild stood in front of the mirror in his $15 million penthouse apartment, adjusting his custom-made Italian silk tie. At 45, he was the epitome of success. CEO of Goldcrest Enterprises, one of New York's most aggressive real estate development firms, with a net worth that made him virtually untouchable. The morning sun, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, caught the silver in his expertly styled hair, and his steel-grey eyes reflected back at him with their usual cold confidence. "Another day, another victory," he muttered to himself, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The board meeting today would be particularly satisfying. He was about to announce the acquisition of 3 more properties in Brooklyn, deals that would displace hundreds but make millions. Business was business after all. As he strode through his marble-floored foyer, Maxwell checked his Patek Philippe watch. 8:45 a.m., right on schedule. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and he stepped in, pressing the lobby button with manicured fingers. The descent was smooth, silent, befitting the most expensive residential building in Manhattan. When the doors opened to the lobby, Maxwell's lip curled involuntarily. There he was again, that security guard, James Wilson, early 50s, slightly overweight, with graying hair and a uniform that always seemed just a little too tight around the middle. The man was a constant reminder of everything Maxwell despised: mediocrity, complacency, failure to rise above one's station in life. "Good morning, Mr. Rothschild," James said with his usual politeness, standing a little straighter at his desk. Maxwell didn't even glance in his direction. "Is my car here?" he demanded, knowing full well it would be. His driver was never late. "Yes, sir, right out front as always." "Then why are you talking to me instead of opening the door?" James moved quickly, too quickly, stumbling slightly as he rushed to get to the heavy glass doors. The sight made Maxwell smile coldly. He loved these little moments, these small reminders of the natural order of things. People like James existed to serve people like him. "Careful there, Wilson," Maxwell said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself. I'm sure at your age, with your fitness level, a fall could be quite serious. And we both know security guard benefits probably don't cover much medical care, do they?" James's face flushed red, but he held the door open without comment. Maxwell could see the man's knuckles whitening on the door handle, could practically feel the humiliation radiating off him. It was delicious. "Tell me, Wilson," Maxwell continued, pausing in the doorway, "how long have you been working here now? 5 years? 6? And still at the same position? Still opening doors and watching monitors? That must be fulfilling." 7 years, Mr. Rothschild," James replied quietly, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "And yes, I find honest work fulfilling." Maxwell laughed, a sharp, cutting sound. "Honest work? Is that what you call it? Standing around all day, watching better men walk by? Well, I suppose someone has to do it. We can't all be winners, can we?" Without waiting for a response, Maxwell strode through the door toward his waiting black Mercedes, where his driver stood ready to open the car door. As he settled into the leather seat, he caught a glimpse of James in the rearview mirror, still standing at attention, still maintaining his dignity despite the verbal lashing. "Pathetic," Maxwell muttered as the car pulled away from the curb. He opened his briefcase, already focusing on the day ahead. The morning's entertainment was forgotten as quickly as it had occurred. Just another pleasant start to another profitable day. What Maxwell didn't notice was the way James's hands trembled slightly as he returned to his post, or the way the other lobby staff exchanged knowing looks. He didn't see the quiet strength in James's bearing as he resumed his duties, nor did he recognize the wisdom in those tired eyes. Maxwell Rothschild saw only what he wanted to see: a man beneath him, a nobody, a stepping stone on his path to greater glory. He couldn't have known that fate was about to teach him the true cost of his arrogance, or that James Wilson would soon become the most important person in his life. For now, Maxwell was content in his tower of pride, blind to the gathering storm that would soon bring it all crashing down around him. The Mercedes glided through Manhattan traffic, its tinted windows separating Maxwell from the world he disdained. Inside his luxurious bubble, he reviewed the documents for today's board meeting, occasionally dictating notes to his AI assistant. The acquisition numbers were impressive. 3 buildings in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods, purchased well below market value, thanks to some creative pressure tactics. "Sir," his driver's voice interrupted his thoughts, "there seems to be a protest gathering outside the office." Maxwell glanced up, annoyed. Sure enough, a small crowd had assembled in front of Goldcrest Enterprises' gleaming headquarters. Their signs told the usual story: stop the evictions, people over profit, homes not hotels. Barely even a dozen of them, Maxwell scoffed. "Drive around to the private entrance and make sure security keeps that rabble away from the building. I don't want to see or hear any of them during my meeting." The board meeting went exactly as Maxwell had planned. His presentation was flawless, the numbers impeccable, and the protests outside served only to demonstrate how ripe the target properties were for development. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, savoring his latest victory, when his personal assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Rothschild, your son's school is on line 1. They say it's urgent." Maxwell frowned. His son, Thomas, attended Westbrook Academy, the most prestigious private school in Manhattan. The boy was a disappointment, sensitive, artistic, nothing like his father, but he never caused trouble. "Rothschild speaking," he barked into the phone. "Mr. Rothschild, this is Headmaster Phillips. There's been an incident with Thomas. He's had some sort of collapse during physical education. The paramedics are here now. They're taking him to Mount Sinai." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Maxwell's hand tightened on the phone. "What do you mean, collapse? What happened?" "They're not sure, sir. He was running laps when he suddenly fell. His heart rate is irregular and—" Maxwell didn't wait to hear more. He was already moving, grabbing his coat, barking orders at his assistant. The drive to the hospital was a blur of anxiety and frustrated rage at traffic lights that dared to slow him down. He hadn't felt this helpless since losing his wife to cancer 3 years ago. Mount Sinai's emergency entrance was chaos. Ambulances, worried families, the steady stream of human suffering that Maxwell usually managed to avoid. He pushed his way to the reception desk, his very presence demanding immediate attention. "My son, Thomas Rothschild. He was just brought in from Westbrook Academy," the receptionist typed on her computer. "Yes, they're running tests now. If you'll have a seat in the waiting area—" "I don't wait," Maxwell snapped. "I want to see him now. Do you have any idea who I am?" "Sir, I understand you're worried, but everyone here is worried about someone. The doctors need to do their work. Please take a seat." Maxwell was about to explode when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Mr. Rothschild?" He turned to find James Wilson standing there in street clothes, a cheap sweater and worn jeans that looked as out of place in Maxwell's world as their owner. "What are you doing here?" Maxwell demanded, his shock momentarily overriding his concern for Thomas. "I'm off duty," James said quietly. "My wife, Sarah, she works here as a cardiac care nurse. I heard them mention your son's name when they brought him in. She's with him now." Maxwell stared at the security guard, unable to process this intersection of their worlds. Before he could respond, a doctor approached, her face serious. "Mr. Rothschild, I'm Dr. Chen. We need to talk about Thomas." The news hit like a physical blow. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a heart condition that had gone undetected despite regular checkups at the city's best hospitals. Thomas needed immediate surgery, but there was a complication. The only surgeon in the city qualified to perform this specific procedure was Dr. William Hayes. "So get him," Maxwell demanded. Dr. Chen's expression tightened. "Dr. Hayes is dealing with a family emergency. He's at Bellevue Hospital with his daughter. She was injured in a car accident this morning." "I don't care about his daughter," Maxwell snapped. "My son needs him now. Whatever he's being paid there, I'll double it, triple it." "Mr. Rothschild," James spoke up from behind him, Bellevue is where the city's trauma center is located. If Dr. Hayes's daughter is there, it must be serious. Maxwell whirled on him. Did anyone ask for your opinion? What are you even still doing here? Sarah, my wife, she's been monitoring Thomas's condition, James said calmly. She's one of the best cardiac nurses in the city. She's the one who recognized the symptoms and called Dr. Chen immediately. Your wife? Maxwell's laugh was bitter. A security guard's wife saved my son's life? Is that what you're telling me? Yes, James replied simply. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Before Maxwell could respond, his phone buzzed. It was his assistant. Sir, I have Dr. Hayes's personal number as requested, but there's something you should know. His daughter was hit by a car this morning while crossing the street. The driver was apparently trying to avoid some protesters outside a building when he swerved onto the sidewalk. Maxwell's blood ran cold. What building? The protest was outside the Goldcrest Tower, sir. They were the same protesters you asked security to remove this morning. The weight of this revelation staggered Maxwell. His own actions, his casual dismissal of the protesters' humanity, had set in motion a chain of events that now threatened his son's life. He looked at James, really looked at him for the first time, and saw not a failure but a man who might hold the key to saving Thomas. Your wife, Maxwell said, his voice hoarse. Can I speak with her? James nodded, understanding in his eyes. Follow me. As they walked through the hospital corridors, Maxwell felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. The man he had mocked and belittled for years was now leading him through this maze of mortality and uncertainty toward the one person who might understand both the medical crisis and the human dimension of his situation. Sarah Wilson was nothing like Maxwell had imagined a security guard's wife would be. She was tall, dignified, with intelligent eyes and an air of quiet competence that immediately commanded respect. She spoke about Thomas's condition with authority and compassion, explaining things in a way that both informed and reassured. Dr. Hayes is the best option, she confirmed. But Mr. Rothschild, he's not going to leave his daughter right now. She's in critical condition. You need to understand, he's not just being difficult, he's being a father. Just like you. The words hit Maxwell like a physical blow. A father, just like you. When was the last time he had actually been a father to Thomas? When had he last attended one of his son's art shows or asked about his dreams? He had been too busy building his empire, too focused on showing the world his power and success. Now, standing in this sterile hospital corridor, Maxwell Rothschild, the man who could buy anything, was discovering that some things couldn't be purchased. Dignity, respect, the right to demand another father abandon his child in crisis. As the reality of his situation sank in, Maxwell felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine fear, not just for Thomas, but for the kind of man he had become. And somewhere in that fear, a small voice whispered that perhaps James Wilson, the man he had dismissed as a failure, might be more successful in the things that truly mattered. The hospital waiting room became Maxwell's prison. Hours crawled by, marked only by the steady beep of distant monitors and the shuffle of nurses changing shifts. Sarah Wilson had arranged for Thomas to be stabilized and monitored constantly, but without Dr. Hayes, they were in limbo. Every minute that passed was another reminder of Maxwell's powerlessness. James brought him coffee, cheap, bitter hospital coffee that Maxwell would normally never touch. But now he accepted it without comment, noticing for the first time how James anticipated exactly how much sugar he used, having observed his habits during countless morning lobbies. "Your son's an artist, isn't he?" James asked, settling into the chair across from Maxwell. Maxwell looked up sharply. "How did you know that?" "I see him in the lobby sometimes, sketching in his notebook. He's talented. Did you know he drew a portrait of Maria, our morning receptionist? Gave it to her on her birthday last month. She has it framed on her desk." Maxwell hadn't known. He hadn't even known Maria had had a birthday, let alone that his son had noticed or cared. The realization stung. "Tell me something," Maxwell said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Why are you here? After everything I've done, everything I've said to you, why help me?" James was quiet for a moment, considering. 7 years ago, before I started working at your building, I was a police detective. 20 years on the force, decorated twice for bravery. Then one night, I responded to a domestic violence call, found a woman beaten nearly to death, her husband still there, still raging. I lost control, beat him so badly he nearly died. Maxwell stared at James, seeing him in an entirely new light. "I resigned before they could fire me," James continued. "No pension, no references. Nobody would hire me except for minimum wage security work. Sarah, she supported me through all of it. Told me one mistake doesn't define a man. It's how he chooses to live afterward that matters. Why are you telling me this? Because you're at that moment now, Mr. Rothschild. The moment where you see yourself clearly, maybe for the first time. And what matters isn't your past actions. It's what you choose to do next." Just then, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face grave. "Mr. Rothschild, we need to talk. Thomas's condition is deteriorating. Without surgery in the next 12 hours. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Maxwell felt the world closing in around him. What about other surgeons? There must be someone else who can do this procedure. There are 2 others in the country qualified for this specific surgery, Sarah explained. One is in Seattle, the other in Houston. We don't have time to fly them in. Maxwell stood up, rage and desperation warring in his voice. Then I'll go to Bellevue myself. I'll talk to Hayes. I'll offer him whatever he wants. Mr. Rothschild, Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. Dr. Hayes' daughter just got out of surgery. She's in critical condition. She may not make it through the night. The words hit Maxwell like physical blows. He thought of the protesters he'd dismissed that morning, the car swerving to avoid them, an innocent girl crossing the street at the wrong moment. His actions, his casual cruelty, forming links in a chain that now threatened both his son and another man's daughter. "Take me to Bellevue," he said suddenly. James and Sarah exchanged looks. "Mr. Rothschild," Sarah began. "Not to make demands," Maxwell clarified, his voice breaking. I need to see. I need to understand." The drive to Bellevue was silent. James insisted on accompanying him, and Maxwell didn't object. The emergency room was even more chaotic than Mount Sinai's, filled with the kind of people Maxwell had spent his life avoiding. The poor, the desperate, the suffering. They found Dr. Hayes in the ICU, a tall man with graying hair and haunted eyes, standing at a window looking into his daughter's room. Maxwell approached slowly, feeling like an intruder in this sacred space of grief. "Dr. Hayes?" The surgeon turned, his exhausted eyes focusing on Maxwell. "You must be Rothschild. They told me you'd probably come. My son needs surgery, I know. And you're here to offer me money or threaten me, or both." Hayes's voice was flat, empty of emotion. "She's 16, Mr. Rothschild. My Emily. She was walking to her volunteer shift at the animal shelter when your protests and your politics and your profit margins put her in the path of that car." Maxwell felt the weight of those words crush him. He looked through the window at the girl in the bed, so small, so still, surrounded by machines keeping her alive. She could have been Thomas. In a way, she was Thomas. Another child paying the price for adult greed and indifference. "I'm not here to offer you anything," Maxwell said quietly. "I'm here to tell you I'm sorry. That's all. I'm sorry." Hayes studied him for a long moment. "Do you know what Emily was doing yesterday? Making posters. She was planning to join those protesters today. She believed in standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Even at 16, she understands something I'm not sure you do. That every human being has value, has dignity, deserves to be seen." Maxwell thought of James Wilson, standing tall despite daily humiliation. He thought of Sarah, working through the night to save lives without recognition or reward. He thought of Thomas, creating beauty in a world his father had made ugly. "I understand now," Maxwell whispered. "Too late, maybe, but I understand." Hayes turned back to the window, placing his hand against the glass. "There's a surgeon at Mount Sinai, Dr. Chen. She trained under me. She's never performed this specific procedure alone, but she has the skills. She's been afraid to try because of the risk. But if I talk her through it remotely, if I guide her, it's not ideal, but it's your son's best chance." Maxwell felt tears spring to his eyes, not from relief, but from the sheer humanity of the offer. This man, whom he had never met, whose daughter lay fighting for life because of him, was offering a lifeline. "Why?" Maxwell asked, his voice barely audible. "Because Emily would want me to," Hayes replied simply. "Because that's who she is, who she raised me to be." As they left the ICU, James steady at his side, Maxwell felt the last walls of his old self crumbling away. He had spent years building a fortress of wealth and power, looking down on people like James Wilson, never realizing that true strength lay in the ability to maintain dignity in the face of cruelty, to offer help even to those who didn't deserve it. The night was far from over. Thomas's surgery still lay ahead, its outcome uncertain. But something had shifted inside Maxwell Rothschild, something fundamental and irreversible. He had seen himself in the mirror of others' humanity, and the reflection would haunt him forever. The operating room observation gallery at Mount Sinai felt like the judgment seat of God. Maxwell stood pressed against the glass, watching as Dr. Chen prepared to operate on his son. The surgeon's hands were steady, but Maxwell could see the tension in her shoulders, the weight of responsibility she carried. Dr. Hayes's voice came clearly through the speakers, calm and professional despite everything. He was guiding her through the setup from his daughter's ICU room at Bellevue, where he sat with a tablet showing the live feed from Mount Sinai's OR cameras. It was an unprecedented arrangement, born of desperate circumstances and human compassion. "A little more exposure on the left ventricle," Hayes instructed. "Just like we practiced, Andrea. You've seen me do this a dozen times." Maxwell felt a presence beside him and turned to find James Wilson there, still in his street clothes, looking as exhausted as Maxwell felt. "Sarah's assisting," James said quietly. "She requested to be on the team. She's worked with Dr. Chen for years. They trust each other." Maxwell nodded, unable to speak. Trust. Such a simple word for something he'd never truly understood until now. He'd always believed trust was something you purchased with money or power. Now he was trusting his son's life to people he would have dismissed as beneath him just 24 hours ago. "Your building's night security called," James continued. "The protesters are back, but they're different now. Word got out about Dr. Hayes's daughter. They're holding a vigil for her and for Thomas." Maxwell turned to look at James, surprised. "Why would they do that, after everything I've done?" "Because they're human beings, Mr. Rothschild, just like you're discovering you are." The surgery proceeded hour by excruciating hour. Every beep of the monitor, every careful instruction from Dr. Hayes, every precise movement of Dr. Chen's hands seemed to stretch into eternity. Maxwell found himself holding his breath, releasing it only when James would quietly remind him to breathe. During one particularly tense moment, when Dr. Chen encountered unexpected complications, Maxwell finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Why did you really stay, James?" The truth this time. James was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the operating room below. "I have a son too," he finally said, "about Thomas's age. When I lost my career as a detective, he was so ashamed. Wouldn't tell his friends what his dad did for a living, started acting out, getting into trouble. But then something changed." "What happened?" "He saw me get up every morning, put on that security uniform, and do my job with pride. Saw me treat people with respect, even when they treated me like dirt. One day he told me he was proud of me, not despite what I'd become, but because of it. Said I taught him that dignity isn't in what you do, but in how you do it." Maxwell felt the words like a physical pain in his chest. When was the last time Thomas had been proud of him? Had he ever been? "Your son draws people, Mr. Rothschild," James continued. "Not just their faces, but their essence. He sees people, really sees them. He got that from somewhere, and I don't think it was from watching you crush people under your heel." Before Maxwell could respond, alarms started blaring in the operating room. Thomas's heart rate was dropping dangerously low. Dr. Chen's voice was tense but controlled as she worked to stabilize him. "BP's dropping," one of the nurses called out. "We need to—" The rest was lost in a blur of medical terminology and urgent movement. Maxwell pressed his hands against the glass, feeling utterly helpless. In that moment, he would have traded every dollar he had, every building he owned, every scrap of power he'd accumulated, just to see his son open his eyes again. "Andrea!" Dr. Hayes's voice cut through the chaos, steady as a heartbeat. "Remember what I taught you about the lateral approach. You can handle this. Think about the anatomy, not the pressure." Dr. Chen took a deep breath, and Maxwell could see her center herself. Her hands moved with renewed confidence, making adjustments that gradually brought Thomas's vitals back to stable levels. As the crisis passed, Maxwell felt his legs give way. He would have fallen if James hadn't caught him, helping him to a nearby chair. For the first time in decades, Maxwell Rothschild broke down completely, sobbing like a child. "I don't deserve their help," he choked out. "Any of them. Hayes, Chen, your wife, you. I've been a monster. I've destroyed lives, treated people like they were nothing. My own son, I don't even know him. What kind of father am I?" "The kind who can still change," James replied simply. "The kind who's learning." Just then, Sarah appeared in the observation room, still in her surgical scrubs. Both men stood, Maxwell barely breathing as he waited for news. "The procedure went well," she said, a tired smile crossing her face. "Dr. Chen did beautifully, and Dr. Hayes's guidance was crucial. Thomas is being moved to recovery. He's not out of the woods yet, but—" She paused, her expression softening. "He was asking for you, Mr. Rothschild. In recovery, before the anesthesia took him under, he was asking for his dad." Maxwell felt fresh tears spring to his eyes. But these were different. Tears of gratitude, of hope, of a love he'd kept buried for too long. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "Dr. Hayes just got word. Emily's condition has stabilized. Her latest scans show improvement. It's still critical, but they think she's fighting." Maxwell closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of everything that had happened. When he opened them again, he saw James and Sarah exchanging a look of such deep understanding and love that it made his heart ache. They had what he'd never achieved with all his wealth, a partnership built on respect, trust, and genuine care for others. "I need to make some calls," he said suddenly, pulling out his phone. "Mr. Rothschild," Sarah began, concern in her voice. "Thomas needs rest." "Not about Thomas," Maxwell assured her. "About the Brooklyn properties, the ones we were going to develop. I need to stop everything, and then I need to make things right." James and Sarah watched as Maxwell stepped away to make his calls, his voice carrying clearly as he began systematically dismantling the plans that would have displaced hundreds of families. He was speaking not with the arrogant authority of before, but with the humility of a man who had glimpsed his own soul in the mirror of crisis and found it wanting. The night was turning to dawn, and with it, Maxwell Rothschild was becoming someone new, someone who might someday be worthy of his son's pride. 3 months after that fateful night at Mount Sinai, Maxwell Rothschild stood in the lobby of his building, but everything was different. The marble floors still gleamed, the lighting was still perfect, but Maxwell no longer saw it as a monument to his success. Instead, he saw it as what it truly was: a home, a workplace, a community. James Wilson was at his usual post, but there was a new nameplate on his desk: Head of Building Security and Community Relations. He nodded at Maxwell with the easy familiarity they'd developed over the past months, no longer separated by artificial barriers of status and wealth. "Thomas's art show opens tonight," James reminded him. "Sarah and I are looking forward to it." Maxwell smiled, remembering how his son's face had lit up when he'd suggested using the building's empty commercial space as a gallery. The space had been intended for a high-end boutique, but Maxwell now saw better uses for it. "He's nervous," Maxwell admitted. "Says he's not sure people will understand his new work." "The ones about Emily Hayes?" Maxwell nodded. During his recovery, Thomas had become obsessed with capturing the story of that night. Not just Emily's accident, but the interconnected web of lives that had been forever changed. His paintings were raw, honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but filled with a humanity that took Maxwell's breath away. The elevator doors opened, and Dr. Andrea Chen stepped out, still wearing her hospital scrubs. She'd taken to stopping by on her way home from shifts, checking on Thomas, even though he was fully recovered. Maxwell suspected she also came to see Maria, the receptionist. The two had become close friends after discovering a shared passion for classical music. "Any word from Emily today?" Maxwell asked her. Dr. Chen's face brightened. "She's being discharged next week. Dr. Hayes says her recovery has been remarkable. She's already talking about going back to her volunteer work, though she's promised to stay away from protest sites for a while." The protest that had nearly cost Emily her life had led to unexpected changes. After Maxwell halted the Brooklyn Development Project, he'd done something unprecedented. He'd invited the protest organizers to meet with him, not to negotiate, but to listen, really listen. What he'd heard had transformed his entire approach to business. Now, Goldcrest Enterprises was pioneering a new model of development, one that prioritized community preservation and affordable housing. The protesters had become partners, helping identify ways to improve neighborhoods without displacing their residents. "Mr. Rothschild," Maria called from the front desk. "The caterers for tonight's opening are here, and the first pieces have arrived from Thomas's studio." Maxwell checked his watch, a simple Timex that had replaced his Patek Philippe. Another change, another lesson in what really mattered. "I'll help them set up," he said, then turned to James. "Would you mind checking the security arrangements for tonight? We're expecting quite a crowd." "Already done," James replied with a smile. "Sarah's bringing extra chairs from the hospital too. Says she wants to make sure the older residents have somewhere comfortable to sit." The mention of the residents brought another smile to Maxwell's face. The building had changed over the past months. Where once it had been an exclusive enclave of the wealthy, it now housed a more diverse community. Maxwell had converted several floors into affordable units for essential workers, nurses, teachers, first responders. The building's atmosphere had transformed from cold luxury to vibrant community. As Maxwell helped the caterers set up in the makeshift gallery, he reflected on how much his life had changed. The man who once measured success in dollars and deals now found his richest moments in simple human connections. He thought of the weekly dinners he now shared with Thomas, where they talked about art and life and dreams. His son was no longer a disappointment, but a source of pride and inspiration. The gallery space slowly came to life as Thomas's paintings were hung. They told a story, not just of one night, but of the countless small moments that connect human beings to each other. There was a portrait of Dr. Hayes sitting vigil at Emily's bedside, his face carved with worry, but also hope. Another showed Sarah Wilson in surgical scrubs, her competent hands saving lives far from the spotlight. James appeared in several pieces, his quiet dignity finally recognized and celebrated. But it was the centerpiece that caught everyone's attention, a large canvas that dominated the main wall. It showed the hospital waiting room that night, but Thomas had painted it as a Renaissance scene, each figure imbued with classical gravity and grace. Dr. Chen bent over her surgical instruments like a scholar at prayer. James and Sarah stood like guardian angels, their ordinary clothes transformed into robes of light. Dr. Hayes appeared both at his daughter's bedside and in the operating room, his presence bridging the gap between tragedy and hope. And in the corner, almost hidden, was Maxwell himself, painted as a man in transformation. Thomas had captured him in the moment of his awakening, his face showing both the arrogance of his past and the humility of his future. It was a portrait of redemption, painful but beautiful. "Dad?" Maxwell turned to find Thomas standing in the doorway, looking uncertain despite his recent success. At 18, he was no longer the timid boy who feared his father's judgment, but a young man coming into his own power, not the power of wealth and influence, but the power to move hearts and change minds through his art. "Is it too much?" Thomas asked, gesturing at the paintings. "I know some of it is pretty intense, especially the ones about that night." Maxwell crossed the room and embraced his son, something that had once felt awkward, but now came naturally. "It's perfect," he said. "It's true." As they stepped back from each other, Emily Hayes appeared in the doorway, walking with the aid of a cane, but otherwise recovered. Her father stood beside her, both of them taking in the artwork with obvious emotion. "Thomas," Emily said, her voice strong, despite everything she'd been through. "These are incredible. You've captured everything, even the things we couldn't say." Dr. Hayes moved through the gallery slowly, stopping at each piece. When he reached the centerpiece, he stood silent for a long moment. "You've made something sacred out of our pain," he finally said, "something healing." The gallery began to fill as residents of the building arrived early, drawn by curiosity and community. Maxwell watched as people from all walks of life mingled naturally. Wealthy executives chatting with maintenance staff, doctors exchanging stories with security guards, artists and accountants finding common ground. Sarah Wilson arrived with a group of nurses from the hospital, all still in scrubs after their shift. They moved through the space with quiet appreciation, occasionally pointing out details that only medical professionals would notice. James joined them, slipping his arm around his wife's waist with the easy affection of a love that had weathered storms. As the official opening time approached, Maxwell found himself standing before Thomas's centerpiece again. He felt a presence beside him and turned to find James there, both of them reflected in the gallery's polished windows. "A year ago," Maxwell said quietly, "I would have looked at you in that window and seen someone beneath me. Now I look at you and see all the ways I fell short as a human being." "That's not what Thomas sees," James replied. "Look at how he painted you, not as who you were, but as who you became. That's what matters." The gallery was full now, humming with conversation and life. Emily Hayes was sitting with a group of young residents, describing her plans to start a community outreach program. Dr. Chen was explaining the medical details of Thomas's surgery to an fascinated audience, while Sarah added insights from a nurse's perspective. Even the former protesters were there, now partners in Maxwell's new vision for ethical development. Thomas approached his father one last time before the official opening. "Dad, I've been offered a scholarship to art school in Paris." Maxwell felt his heart skip, not from disappointment, as it once would have, but from pride. "That's amazing, son. When do you leave?" "That's the thing," Thomas said, shuffling slightly. "I'm thinking of deferring for a year. I want to stay and help with the community art program we talked about. There are so many stories here that need to be told, so many voices that haven't been heard." Maxwell looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not the disappointment he'd once imagined, but a young man of profound empathy and vision. "Whatever you choose," he said, "I'm proud of you, not because of what you do, but because of who you are." As the evening progressed, Maxwell found quiet moments with each person who had been part of his transformation. He thanked Dr. Hayes for his forgiveness, Dr. Chen for her courage, Sarah for her compassion, but it was his moment with James that meant the most. "You know," Maxwell said, "I never properly apologized for how I treated you all those years." James shook his head. "You didn't need to apologize. You needed to change, and you did. Still," Maxwell insisted, "I want you to know, that first night at the hospital, when you stayed with me despite everything, that was true strength, the kind I never had." "You have it now," James replied simply. The gallery opening was a success by any measure, but its true significance went beyond art sales or critical acclaim. It marked a transformation, not just of one man, but of an entire community. Maxwell Rothschild, who had once built walls to separate himself from others, had learned to build bridges instead. As the evening wound down, Thomas pulled his father aside one last time. "There's one more painting," he said. "In the back room. I wasn't sure whether to show it." They slipped away from the crowd, and Thomas unveiled a smaller canvas. It showed Maxwell in his lobby, not as the commanding figure he'd once been, but as a man reaching out to help someone up. The someone was indistinct. It could have been James, or Emily, or any of the countless people whose lives intersected with theirs. "This is how I see you now," Thomas said softly, "not as the man who had everything, but as the man who learned what everything really means." Maxwell felt tears in his eyes as he hugged his son. Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythm. But inside this space, something miraculous had occurred. A man who had once measured his worth in dollars and cents had learned to measure it in moments of grace, in lives touched, in bridges built where walls once stood. The security guard he had once despised was now his closest friend. The woman he had dismissed as just a nurse had helped save his son and taught him the true meaning of dignity. The doctor whose life he had inadvertently upended had shown him the power of forgiveness, and his son, whom he had once seen as a disappointment, had become his greatest teacher. Maxwell Rothschild had lost his empire of pride, but in its place he had gained something far more valuable, a kingdom of the heart, where every person's dignity was sacred and where true wealth was measured not in what you possessed, but in what you gave away. The night ended as it had begun, with Maxwell standing in his lobby. But now he stood not as a master of his domain, but as a member of a community, a father, a friend, and most importantly, a human being who had learned the costliest and most valuable lesson of all, that true pride comes not from looking down on others, but from lifting them up. And in the end, that was worth more than all the wealth in the world. What would you do if you had the chance to redeem yourself from your mistakes? Do you believe everyone deserves a second chance to transform their life? Share your opinion in the comments. Your perspective might help others reflect on the power of transformation and the true meaning of success. If this story touched your heart and made you think, give it a like and subscribe. Every week we bring you stories that will make you feel, think, and perhaps change your perspective on life. And don't miss the next story appearing to your left. I promise it will take you on the same emotional roller coaster you just experienced. A story where destiny proves that sometimes the most unexpected twists in life are exactly what we need to find our true purpose.